Wano Country is a very controversial arc. It might be one of the most, if not the most, in the entire story of One Piece. Either I see it on, let's say, folks' top 5, or not even their top 10, or even top 15 in terms of the overall ranking of their arcs. And some folks would just say that Wano Country is either the best arc or just plain sucks. And the reason why it's on my mind again is because I saw a video recently by Werb. And Werb on YouTube did a video titled "Why Wano Didn't Have Steaks," not ribeyes or T-bones or New York strips, not things you stab vampires with, but the actual consequences, the win or loss stakes that normally you would see in various arcs, and how Wano Country, it has that, but it doesn't have it to the same degree as other arcs in his opinion. And normally I don't have time to watch other folks' videos like that, but this kind of did catch my eye, and I did sit down and watch it, and I thought it was a pretty good video. Why he believes that Alabasta did things right, but Wano Country which did not do things as good. There are many major points of failure in the arc in terms of actual story written failures. So talk about Luffy losing to Kaido, the Scabbard versus Kaido, Luffy loses to Kaido again, rooftop, and then the final time when, before it goes into Gear 5, he kind of dies. So there are major points of failure in the entire Wano Country arc. In his opinion, the first one being the best one, but even still, they don't compare to what, let's say, we get in Alabasta. And his reasoning for it is actually pretty interesting too, so you can see the video yourself. But there are essentially things like the consequences of a certain situation in, let's say, Dressrosa would lead to the birdcage changing all of Dressrosa in the process. Or let's say Luffy feeling to be Crocodile for the first time leads to an eventual war where thousands of folks are losing their lives. Things of that sort. So whether or not, let's say, you agree or disagree with the idea that the stakes of Wano Country were not as intense or well thought out as previous arcs, I think it's up to you. It's very subjective, like these things normally are. Like, you could argue, for example, that Kaido just being able to execute his plan in any capacity, dropping Onigashima onto the city and then turning Wano Country into an entire slave factory via the new Onigashima project, that threat in of itself was enough for the stakes. But in watching that video that Werb did, it got me thinking about the reasons why I think that Wano Country is not in the top end of One Piece arcs. I did a stream about 2 years ago, the top 15 best arcs of One Piece, and Wano Country at that point in time was not in my top 10. And I would say things have gotten even worse for Wano Country because Elbaf, I think, is on pace to be better than Wano Country, and I would absolutely say that Egghead Island is better than Wano Country. Furthermore, I would say that the anime version is a superior product than the manga version. There are issues like, for example, when Werb brought up how Luffy lost the third time round in chapters 10, 13, and 10, 14, when Luffy is sent packing off the island, Onigashima, we don't see what happens in the manga version. And that is actually one of the major points of contention that Werb has with the stakes of the arc. But in the anime version, episode 1033, not only is it a vastly superior version where they actually show you the fight, but it winds up being one of the best parts in the entirety of Wano Country when you find out that for half that fight, Kaido was so immersed into the fight, he was hallucinating fighting Luffy, which gives us a level of depth to the character of Kaido that the manga version has not delivered. I digress. Wano Country still has issues nonetheless, whether it be anime or manga. And while I think it's fair that some folks say it does suck, and knowing me how I ramble so much, I'm gonna try and just keep things very concise and orderly. And so I'll break it down to 3 major parts. Right into it, part number 1. Wano Country has some of the best moments in the entirety of One Piece. I would say that is a very fair thing to claim, i.e., Roger versus Whitebeard in the Oden flashback. A phenomenal moment. Another moment would be the chapter 1044, Luffy reveals Gear 5 for the first time. And then I would say after that, the subsequent chapter of chapter 1045, which I gave a 10 out of 10 rating. One of the few times I gave One Piece a 10 out of 10 rating. But on the flip side, it also has some of the worst moments, like just insult to intelligence, some of the worst moments in the entire series of One Piece. And I'm going to go through some of the moments that I think a lot of people were either extremely mixed on or absolutely hated as a collective, where most people, week to week readers, would say that this moment was really bad. So number 1 would be chapter 931, when Big Mom loses her memories and goes through the amnesia. And this, I think, was one of the few times you saw people at that point in time actively denounce what Oda was doing. A lot of us seasoned cats in One Piece scene kind of saw this moment as a major plot device moment for Big Mom, where Big Mom was going to probably be a net negative for her allied forces and wound up being a boon later on in the story to the Straw Hats in some way, which she clearly was in the Udon prisoner mines. Her shenanigans during that section of the arc forced Queen out of the area, which opened the gateway for them to take control of the prisoner mines. And Mother Mode Big Mom, an excuse that allowed essentially Oda to have Big Mom do massive damage to an opponent that Usopp and Nami couldn't defeat apparently in Ulti and page 1, and in chapter 10-13 later on in the arc we see the Maester Cannon essentially fry Ulti's internal organs, and prior to that Big Mom just handled page 1. So normally in the past Oda will actually have some way of Nami and Usopp really using their wits and their tactics to overcome a challenge. Or those Alabasta, when Usopp and Chopper have to fight against Mr. Four and Miss Merry Christmas, or whether it's Enies Lobby, where Nami fought against Khalifa, they've always been able to overcome opponents that were way stronger than them through tactics and through sheer grit. But in Wano Country, he exploited Big Mom as a plot device to assist Nami and Usopp, and it is, I think, a net negative for them, particularly Usopp, who really gets no shine during that arc. Let's say net positive. And knowing that Big Mom was going to be a plot device that ultimately would benefit the Straw Hats was such a jarring 180 from her role in the previous arc, where because of her actions, an ally of theirs had to sacrifice himself so he could escape Thailand. Another moment that would live in absolute One Piece infamy is at the end of chapter 10-14. And then the follow-up later on, where Kaido proceeds to double tap after grabbing a sword, which should have been the end of a character named Kinemon. But instead, Oda decides to really insult our intelligence into believing that somehow, some way, this makes any modicum of sense. 16 chapters later, in chapter 10-30, we see Kinemon literally split in half. And apparently, all this time, he was never properly attached from Punk Hazard. That was one of the greatest insults to a One Piece fan's intelligence I've ever seen in my life. Whether it was on my channel, Brago's channel, Roger's channel, Zoro Fanboy's channel, you name it, there are so many people that resoundingly said, this is embarrassingly stupid. This is horrible. How could you not just kill Kinemon and be done with it? And the idea of stakes and consequences in Wano Country not being to the same extent as previous arcs. Death isn't the end all be all for trauma and for raising the stakes in a story. That's fair in many respects. And while Wano Country does have a lot of character deaths, not all character deaths are created equal. There's a big difference between, let's say, someone like Yasue or someone like Ashura Doji dying versus someone like Whitebeard dying or someone like Ace dying. That's very obvious. And Kinemon would have been a character that, if he did die, would have been a more meaningful death to a lot of One Piece readers, but Oda could not commit to it. So Kinemon's fake out death, I would say comfortably, is the worst fake out death in the history of One Piece, probably by several orders of magnitude. It is way worse than Pell's fake out death, and it was a pretty cowardly thing for Oda to do to keep Kinemon alive. Another major insult to injury, which ties to part number 2 of my core reasons to why this arc is not a top echelon arc. It is the conclusion of the arc. I would say that Wano Country has the worst conclusion out of any conclusion of any post time skip arc in the story to date. I'm gonna say that again. Wano Country has so far the worst conclusion out of any conclusion of the One Piece post time skip to date. And you may say that's crazy, but if that is crazy, then why is it that episode 1084 exists? Episode 1084 exists to try and fill in some of the gaps, the glaringly obvious, horrific gaps that were left wide open in Wano Country. Promises that characters made that were not fulfilled, parties that were just forgotten about, and so on and so forth. We just leave. Episode 1084, this episode is essentially filler that tries to tie in some of these loose ends with some of these party members that were pouring to us for about a good 4 years of the entirety of Wano Country, but even still far from actually fixing the issue itself, because it was like applying Vaseline to a bullet wound and the bullet's still in the body. And obviously folks who point to the fact that Zoro never visited Ryoma's grave at the end, which is true. That was horrible thing, obviously, that Oda never addressed, or even the plot points surrounding the Nidai Katetsu. That's just dropped and forgotten for some strange reason, even though it seemed to be one of very great interest at the very beginning of Wano Country. Those things, though, are not the biggest issue. The biggest issue has been and will always be, until they are officially a part of the crew on that ship, the moment that Oda assured the readers would happen, because he had the character repeat it time and time again, but wound up not happening, Yamato joining the crew. Chapter 1057 starts off in horrific fashion when she reveals that she will not be going on the Straw Hat ship. And to be fair, this was relatively mixed, because some folks did not like this at all, like myself. Other folks championed it because Yamato, for them as a character, was unappealing for various reasons. But you could argue it's in the same vein as Gear 5 Luffy himself, where Gear 5 I think is one of the greatest things of all time. But on the flip side, I've seen people actually drop the series because of Gear 5 Luffy. I would say Yamato is in the same vein, because Yamato openly tells crew members that she's going to join the crew, and she's accepted by the crew, effectively speaking. But for various reasons, which I won't get into now, Oda decided not to have Yamato join the crew, at least not immediately, which is still an insult to injury considering all the things that were said about Yamato joining the crew for so long, for years, 50, 60 plus chapters, and come our arrival to Agate Island, Yamato is not with the crew. So those are some of the biggest insults to injury along the conclusion of the Wano Country, which I thought was some of like the worst components of the arc, but not the worst reason. You can argue this is the core reason why a vast majority of the other problems of Wano Country exist, is because of this chart right here. Shout to ChatGPT. This chart is a representation of how many characters were a part of each arc so far in the entire series, including the ongoing Elbaf arc. And you can see throughout the entirety of the series, there are a lot of characters. Some you have 40 characters that are a part of an arc. Some are going to the 50. Some are reaching 60 in terms of characters that are part of the arc. Whole Cake Island, Big Mom and her children. We have like 60 characters of relevance in those arc. And of those 60, you'd have, let's say, around like 37 of them being relatively unique and significant characters. That's 37 unique and significant characters in a single arc. Most stories do not manage that many characters in an arc, let alone them being significant characters in some way, plot movers in some way. Even a story like My Hero Academia can barely manage one class. Look at Marineford. That's so many people involved. Marineford is teetering on like 50 characters of prominence, and of those 50 characters, 27 of them are unique and significant characters that are plot movers. So you can see how Oda has been adding more and more and more characters on a regular basis to a lot of these arcs. But the Wano Country bar is the Burj Khalifa of the whole chart. Wano Country has almost 120 characters that are involved in the story. Compared to Marineford, it's almost tripling Marineford. It's almost tripling Marineford, ladies and gentlemen. If you combine Jaya and Skypiea together in terms of characters of prominence, it is literally tripling Jaya and Skypiea combined. And of those 120 some odd characters, 80 of these characters are characters of unique significance to the actual plot. This is a mind-blowing, just seeing the actual chart. It is a mind-blowing realization of the core issue of Wano Country. I have said before, I'll say again in this video, that Wano Country is for sure the longest arc in the entire series of One Piece, but it also feels rushed. Wano Country, that's right, is a rushed arc. And folks would call me crazy when I said it back then, but when I see this chart, I think it only proves my ideas right, where Wano Country should have been 5.5 to 6 years long, considering the amount of major players that Oda was working with in Wano Country and how much time each character would need based on previous arcs and how much time Oda gave certain major players, certain main characters, groups and factions for world building sake, of course, flashbacks, things of that sort. So whether your issue with the story involves pace, whether it involves characterization and character development, character growth, whether it involves the stakes, as what Webb said in his video. An example that we're brought up, let's say, of trying to fix one of the major failures of the story, for number 3, when Luffy gets punted off the island by Kaido, instead of Yamato stalling out Kaido, you have the Straw Hats come up there somehow, some way, and they try and deal with Kaido. Like in the same vein as, let's say, Thriller Bark, where in Thriller Bark, the Straw Hats had to fight against Oar's Luffy when Monkey D himself was lost in the forest. So a situation where you have the crew themselves defending Luffy on the rooftop, that could have been a great way to showcase the consequences of Luffy's failure, and several Straw Hats getting gravely injured as a result of that. Not just, let's say, Luffy and Zoro themselves in the arc, but it would also include Nami, it would also include Usopp, it also include, let's say, Chopper. Half the crew would require prolonged treatment because of Luffy's failure. But no, instead we have Yamato. And you can point to several reasons to why this is the case, but I think the core reason would also stem from the fact that there are other characters that need to get some attention to even stride attention. So whether it's these CP agents that are involved with Brook and Robin, whether it's Usopp wants to be with Kikunojo and Kinemon who are at death's door, Kinemon damn near doing mouth to mouth with Grim from Billy and Mandy himself, whether it's Jinbei having to do the water jutsu with Raizo, the list goes on and on and on, whether it's Sanji being treated by Osome and the Pleasure Quarter girls after the Queen fight. There are so many characters that are involved in this arc. There's not enough time, especially given Oda's mindset and how Oda likes to give a lot of prominent characters some shine here and there at the bare minimum, but there's just not enough time like they could in previous arcs. Even in terms of like Marineford standards, even that would be a hard-pressed thing to do in Wano country, because Marineford in terms of amount of characters, because Marineford is almost getting 3x in terms of character numbers in Wano. It's unbelievable. This is why I think a lot of folks are justifiable in saying that Wano country sucks. It's not my top 10 arcs, though Yamato joining the crew would retroactively make the arc better. Yes, it would, but we're not there yet. On that note, I was inspired with this video because, again, just seeing that word video got me going for Wano country. On that note, let me know your stance on the subject matter at hand. If you enjoy your boys' video content, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and click on that bell to join the notification squad. I'm gonna catch you guys and gals on the flip side.
See you. Bye-bye.